welcome once again to another Coffee and Heroes podcast. We're delighted to be back with another creator interview, and it is no less than our 200th episode. And this is actually our second 200th episode. We like to do a little bit of a variant tease here. Two different creators, both from our part of the world, no less as well. But for today's guest, needs no introduction, but hey, I'm going to do it anyway. So I think the words industry legend do get bandied about a lot, but they're not, but they are particularly pertinent when talking about today's guest. It's actually probably easier to list the companies he hasn't worked with as opposed to the ones that he has. DC, he's worked for DC, Vertigo, Marvel, Image, Dynamite, Avatar, TKO, Aftershock, Rebellion, the list goes on and on. He was a massive part of arguably the greatest era of creator-driven comics, with the Vertigo era under Karen Berger ushering in a frankly ridiculous time of top-level comics and amazing creators at the top of their game. He revitalized Punisher with Marvel Comics, spearheading a new label under the Marvel Max Comics, with issues and series aimed at an older, more discerning audience. And that's even before we mentioned The Boys, Preacher, and way too many others. So your host is always Alan, owner of Coffee and Heroes in Belfast, joined today by Keith as ever for a Q&A session with none other than Garth Ennis. Good evening, sir, and how are you keeping?
Doing good, thank you. And thank you for that lovely introduction.
I do get complimented for my intros. I find it's always good. It relaxes the creative talent, that ego a little bit,
Yeah.
So but yeah, I mean, let's start off with a big question. We are a Northern Irish comic book podcast, of course. You're a comic creator originally from here. For our listeners, tell us a little bit about whereabouts you're from and what it was like being a comic book fan in Northern Ireland at the time you were getting interested.
Mm. So I was born in Belfast, but grew up in Hollywood. And went to school there as well. Did about a month and a half at Queens, and then left to write comics. As to the comics I read when I was a kid, it was actually a kind of a weird quirk of the distribution peculiar to Northern Ireland, or at least my part of Northern Ireland, that in a weird way got me where I've gotten to, because unlike most people in this business, I saw very few American comics as a kid. You would see them from time to time in the newsagent, but not with any regularity. It would have been very hard for me, I think, to build up any kind of a coherent run on any of those books. Now compare that with John McCrae, who lived in Belfast, and with enormous effort and by visiting every newsagent he could reach on his bike, managed to get a decent run of Marvel and DC comics of various titles. I never did. I didn't really know that was an option, because what got a lock on my imagination in that age, and there were no problems with distribution here, were the British comics of the era. And this is where I got lucky. 2000 AD and Battle and Commando and various other titles too, but those were the ones that really did it. You had the picture libraries as well, War and Battle picture libraries. It's because of that when I look back on my past, and everyone looks back on their past when they're talking about the influences on their comics work, it's pretty much all British comics. I don't discover American comics in any real way until I'm in Crane's bookshop, now long gone, in 1986, and I found a copy of the trade paperback of Dark Knight, and that is my first American comic, cover to cover. And that, so as you can imagine, that gives me something of a skewed take on things, and it's why my attitude towards traditional American stuff is a bit off.
That's fair to say. I mean, the problem there is once you start off with Dark Knight Returns, it's all downhill from there.
That is largely what I found. I I thought that what I'd done was clearly been wrong. Obviously, American comics were great after all. Those funny wee things I saw on the news agents and sort of picked up and leafed through, but never really got much of a sense of what was happening. I'd been wrong about that, so I rushed out straight away and bought about a dozen American imports, and of course they were all awful, because Dark Knight, I didn't realize it, but Dark Knight was a quantum leap. Dark Knight was not just this fantastic piece of pulp fiction where the Batman characters, which I knew from the old Adam West show.
Hmm.
I was familiar with them from that, where those characters are treated with a kind of degree of maturity and dignity that they never really had before. It's not just this amazing piece of pulp fiction, it is a leap forward for comics in format, in scope, in everything. And it left everything else far behind, of course. This is something that I realized in over the coming years as I got a much better sense of the American industry.
Yeah.
And I mean, at that time in Belfast, Garth, you'd be very close to Talisman taking root and opening up.
Um,
Would that be correct?
that's right. I think it was Dark Horizons first. I think they came along in '87, and then Talisman, which of course is now FP Belfast, at the very beginning of '88. So it would have been they would have been on their way at that point. Yeah.
Making it much easier to get a hold of runs and sort of
Yeah.
what you needed. Yeah.
Yeah. But of course, by then, my sense of these things is pretty much set. I haven't read Dark Knight and then things like Elektra and Watchmen and Concrete and the better American stuff that's coming out at the time. It's very hard for me to go back and read runs on regular American comics by most of the writers and artists around at the time with any degree of interest. I can't really take that stuff seriously because, as I say, there has been this quantum leap. If I had seen that stuff as a kid, a little kid, when I was reading 2000 AD and Battle and so on, if I'd seen those American titles, then there is no question that they would have the same lock on me, that sort of mixture of nostalgia and sentimentality that the things you read as a kid give you. But I didn't read them then, so I never had that. And if they don't get you as a kid, I would say they just don't get you.
Well,
I
we
think
should.
I think there's a certain amount of truth to that. I mean, as Keith said, I get into comics a little bit later. I mean, I watched all the animated series and things like that when I was younger, but I never really get into comics properly until Batman Begins came out. I was working in a cinema. I was more
Okay.
into movies. And then a friend said, "Oh, you enjoyed that? Here's Batman Year One. This is what it was based on." And I read that, and I've never looked back since. So, I'm honing in on 20 years of collecting and reading and enjoying anyway. But as you say, I maybe came in at a more mature era, where comics were
Yeah.
aimed maybe at an older audience, and there was more
I mean,
craft, more refinement.
if the first thing you're handed is Batman Year One, then in a way, like me with Dark Knight, you have an enormous advantage, but at the same time, you have a very skewed view
Hmm.
of the rest of the US industry because you're going to find out rapidly that not much stands up to that standard.
Yeah. Very well. I mean, not much stands up to Batman anyway, but I'll leave Keith to argue that one with me.
So we would very classically, Garth. I would adopt a pro Marvel stance and
Oh, I do.
Alan a pro DC stance, while both buying more indie than anything else. But sure, it makes for good chats.
Very much so. I mean, obviously, with reading Dark Knight Returns first, did that mean that once you did get into comics at that level, did that make you more of a DC guy, or was there Marvel stuff you were enjoying at the time as well, or indeed independent stuff coming through?
I've never really had much sense of company loyalty in that sense. I go where I find good stuff. And
Hmm.
that was a really interesting period because, as I say, Dark Knight, Watchmen, Swamp Thing, Miracle Man, Elektra, Ronin, Concrete, Peter Bagg is doing neat stuff at that point. It's just a year or so before British comics makes its own attempt on what we'll call maybe the adult market, the more mature market. And there is this incredible sort of like overflowing cauldron of amazing talent producing these incredible stories. And it really gives you the sense that comics are about to go through the roof creatively and in every other way. Not quite what happened, but it was an incredible time, I think, to be thinking about comics and to be thinking about as I was getting into the industry.
On that, I guess on that point, so you're going from a comic fan about the Belfast area to breaking into the industry. How did that happen? How did you break into the industry? Was that always your aim to get into the comics industry, or did you have
Um,
other aspirations?
I think for most of my sort of mid to late teenage years, I'd had sort of vague creative ambitions, and the more I read of the comics that were being produced, the more I thought that comics were for me. They seemed to be growing and evolving in a very, very quickly and in a very interesting way. And I thought this is for me. And I really admired what I was seeing from people like Alan Moore, who was able to follow from 2000 AD into American comics, um, and the people I was discovering in the American industry. I thought, yes, this is for me. And so um, oh, I should say, by the way, that fandom at the time in Belfast, I mean, I guess it existed and it certainly crystallized around those two stores when they opened, but I wasn't really aware of it to any great degree. The brushes with fandom I had would have been more when I visited London, which I did a couple of times in the early to mid 80s, and was able to visit Forbidden Planet, which of course was advertised in 2000 AD. You saw the ads at the time and
Mm-hmm.
you it was the home of Titan Books and everything. Um, and it was there that I got a sense, seeing, the whole store full of these American imports, full of original artwork for sale, full of fanzines, a couple of which I bought, and saw people writing seriously about comics for the first time. That was really part of my brief brush with fandom before I got into the business itself. I never really had a chance to immerse myself in that fully. But what happened was, in the end, it was very simple. Crisis, which was the political comic that 2000 AD published, and had a great deal of hope and ambition for. I mean, there was a lot riding on that comic. Had a signing tour, and it went all over the UK, and it also came to the Talisman in Northern Ireland. And I went along and I met Pat Mills and John Smith and Jim Bakey. And I also met Steve McManus, the editor. And I got talking to him and I said, would you be interested in a story about the Troubles here in Northern Ireland, which in 1988 were still very much
Mm.
ongoing? And he said, that's exactly what we'd want. That's exactly the kind of story that we set this comic up to publish in the first place. So that would have been about October or November. I went home, wrote up an outline, sent it in. And on my 19th birthday, the following January, I thought, nothing ventured, nothing gained, and called the office. And instead of, yeah, we'll call you, I got, oh yeah, we like that. We wanted to talk to you. And that was basically how it started. Yeah. After I put the phone down, I had to sort of slap myself a bit, like, did that really happen? But it did.
I bet you were glad you made that phone call.
I was. I mean, they said they were going to call me anyway, but who knows? It might have been one of those things where if I hadn't, the guy would have gone to something else on the to-do list or to someone else. He might have reached into the submissions pile and found something else. So probably a good job I called.
Yeah, good. I mean, good for all of us, Garth, because we're saying that you've kind of been a trailblazer for creators from Northern Ireland and Ireland getting into the industry, and we've been lucky enough to interview quite a few folks, and yeah, so I mean, you've never been shy about I guess taking others with you,
Hmm.
paving the road, and that's something I think we're all fairly grateful for.
Hmm. Good. Yeah. Well, I mean, you mentioned PJ. He's an obvious one. Uh, Love working with PJ, and obviously John McCrae. Although, just thinking about it, I wouldn't have been the first, because Will Simpson had already been working in comics for 3 or 4 years at that point. I think he had Gary Leach and Dave Elliott had a sort of a creative partnership.
Mm.
So it's all been a
But anyway,
lie. It's all built upon a lie then.
yeah, the whole thing built on a foundation of sand.
Well, I mean, you mentioned there it was obviously when you were 19, you submitted that outline and so forth. I
Mm.
mean, you then obviously embarked on a long, creative career. And during that time, did you adapt a very set process for writing? Are you a very strict 9 to 5 kind of guy, or are you a night owl, or is it just whenever
Uh,
inspiration takes hold?
Generally, I work in the afternoon and early evening. Um, I don't really care when I work, so long as it gets done. But I try to live reasonably social hours. Um, Once I think I was probably still writing in the wee small hours in my mid 20s, but you get to a certain point and you just realize, there's no need for this. There's no particular point for this. It takes you out of sync with everything else. So why bother? So uh, reasonably, I've kept reasonably social hours for the last 25 years or so. And like I say, so long as it gets done, So there could be a day where I do nothing. There could be a day where I write 10 or 12 pages.
Mm. I'm sure one day's more satisfying than the other
Yeah,
in that case. And
very
I mean,
much.
what about your relationship as a writer with the artist? You mentioned PJ there and so forth. I mean, how collaborative is the process between you and the artist you work with? Do you both sort of stay in your own lanes as writer and artist, or are you back and forth in ideas much more than that?
It varies from artist to artist. Um, there are some people who you don't have to do anything. You just give them the script and let them go. Um, Most obviously, Steve Dillon. He and I never talked about work at all. That surprises people sometimes, but we never really talked about it. We just each of us trusted the other to get on with the job, and I think it because of that experience, I think it just led to so much good work, because each of us had the experience of finding someone they clicked with. More recently, I've worked with Steve Epting and Chris Burnham, guys who I'd heard of and liked their work but had never worked with. Um, and there's always a little anxiety when you work with someone for the first time because you're thinking, will they get it? Do they know what I'm going for here? Um, and then the pages came in, and in both cases, it was like they'd been looking in my head. It was perfect. That's you can't ask for a better experience than that. Other artists need to be sort of kept on the straight and narrow, as it were. There are people. I mean, I won't mention anyone, but there are people who their attention wanders. They're in a hurry. They try to do 2 or 3 pages in the time it would take to do one good one, and you find yourself having to say to them, "No, look at the script. The script says X, Y, and Z. You've drawn A, B, and C,
Hmm.
and if you do that, the sequence that you're drawing will make no sense in the overall narrative. Look what happens." And something else I try to do is provide the entire story, all the scripts, like if it's a mini series, all 4 or all 6 scripts before the
Oh.
artist has to draw anything, so he can read them all and he can go through, and that way there'll be no surprises for him in the last episode. He shouldn't draw something in the first episode that makes a sequence in the last one impossible. And that's why with the kind of, what would you say, scattier artist that I do sometimes work with, you do find yourself having to say that to people. Look, if you do this here in episode 1, it will make no sense later when this has to happen in episode 6. And those are the people that you do have to keep a tighter rein on, because their attention wanders, because they're just programmed differently
Mm.
to the more sort of coherent one brick at a time guys, like that I was talking about earlier.
And nothing like a Northern Irish accent to keep people in the straight and narrow.
I find a discreetly worded email usually gets.
Well, you've mentioned there, you like to give artists the entire story if it's a mini series, the entire script, that kind of thing. So does that mean that you would tend to focus on one project at a time, or are you quite proficient in juggling multiple titles at any one time?
I used to be better at that, at what you've just described. I mean, Preacher and Hitman, and later on The Punisher, I wrote 1 week on, 1 week off, and I had no trouble. Um, as I've gotten older, I found it easier to focus on one thing for the period it takes to write the whole story. Now, that's not always possible. On something like The Boys, there was no way I could write 90 episodes in one go. It just wouldn't have been economically viable for the publisher. But what I did do was I broke it down into story arcs. So when Russ Braun was doing one of his, he would have all 4 issues. John McCrae would have all 4 issues, and so on and so forth. And when John was doing, say, the Highland Laddie miniseries, he had the whole thing when he started. Since then, because I haven't really been doing what we call longer form stories, it's been much easier to just give artists all 4 or all 6 so that they have them before they get stuck in, or if not, damn close to it.
Yeah, and obviously talking about juggling projects, you also juggle work between, DC, recently Batman Reptilian, Marvel, Punisher Soviet, indie companies, Lion and Eagle, and so forth. I mean, how do you find that the companies differ in any way, or is it just a case of, given how long you've been working in the industry, do you have a lot of freedom with the projects you work on, or are you heavily edited at one over the other, or anything like that?
There are little differences. They tend to be more technical. They tend to be more to do with organization and structure. So, for instance, you work for DC, you get a very carefully figured out royalty statement exactly every 3 months. At Marvel, it's a good deal more random. But when it comes to actually working for them, well, what I find is it's not a question of companies so much as people. It's it's finding people on the editorial level that you can trust. You need people to keep the rest of the company at bay, which sounds like an odd thing to say, but there can be elements at any company that will get in your way. People who aren't maybe your biggest fan, people who don't like what you're doing with the characters, whereas the editors you work for, they'll be expert at negotiating those particular river rapids and making sure that those people can't interfere. Sometimes it's not even as malevolent as that. Sometimes it's just a lack of coherence, a lack of organization at the company, and the you trust the editor to keep that stuff out of your way. So at DC, I've been friends with Marie Javins for 20 or 25 years. She runs the place, so I don't have much trouble at DC.
Mm-hmm.
At Marvel, I work with an editor called Nick Lowe, who's quite senior, but I've known Nick for 20 years. I mean, I think we met when he was about 20, 21 or something. And he and I clicked in that sense, and he proved to be very, very good at negotiating my stuff through the territory, as it were, at Marvel. So what you do is you find people you can trust, and then you're free to do work for those companies. Now that's doing work for hire on company-owned characters like the ones you talked about. If it's at the indie companies, well, then you go where it's a question of trust, people you trust, but you're also looking for the best creator-owned deal. So I work for Aftershock, who run by Joe Pruitt, who I've known for a long time. Upshot, run by Axel Alonso, known him since the mid 90s. And again, it's trust. So, but because it's going to be creator owned, you are looking for that good deal. You are looking for the best possible circumstances or conditions under which to do the book you're doing. So ultimately, it's a question of conditions plus competence, you might say.
Well, that's fair. I mean, you mentioned Aftershock there as well, and The Lion and the Eagle was a recent release, just finished off the 4 issues, trade on the way. And one thing I've wanted to ask a writer about with regards to this is we'd asked PJ about his thoughts, on the bigger page format, like DC Black Label 2000 AD size, that kind of thing. Does that affect the writing process in any way, or do you just, write for the page and that's it? I'm just genuinely curious. Do you think in bigger scope, or does it not affect it at all?
Not much, although with that book, and forthcoming Jimmy's Little Bastards and the Battle Action book, because it's all roughly the same page size, I might find myself writing in a couple of extra panels.
Mm-hmm.
Is something in that format where you'll have a bit more space compared to the traditional American format, where a 7-panel page, even a 6-panel page, is often a bit much to ask of an artist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was just genuinely curious because we go back and forth on this. Keith hates that size of format. He calls it silly size comics because it doesn't fit in a comic box. Whereas I love
Right.
it because I think it feels big and cinematic, and and
Well, I've
2000
heard,
AD size boxes are available.
yeah, I mean, creatively, I like it very much, and it really did grow on me over the period. But the first thing I thought of when they told me they were going to do it, when they sent me a few other books other people had done in that format, the first thing I thought was, what are retailers going to say about this?
Mm-hmm.
The answer to that would appear to be, very broadly speaking, it depends on the project. Lion and the Eagle seems to have done, Aftershock have told me, quite well.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but they have had other books in that format that haven't done so well, and that's where the complaints tend to come from. So, in other words, commercial success seems to have overcome those kinds of technical objections in this one case. That doesn't mean it always will.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, DC have obviously done a lot of Black Label books, and we've certainly seen fluctuations at our store anyway. You stick Batman on a book, it's probably going to sell well. Whereas I think the
Right.
best book through DC Black Label has actually been Harleen, which was fantastic, but it wasn't a big seller for us. But no, I was just interested from a writer's point of view. But we'll move away and into your work a little bit more at this point. I mean, you have a massive body of work, to call back on, and so much of it is trailblazing and successful, from the Punisher Max run to Preacher at Vertigo to Crossed with Avatar and to The Boys. Is there any particular run that stands out to you that was just so much fun and so creatively satisfying?
Um, Many of them were, and so it's hard to pick one that really stands
I know
out.
it's like saying, do you have a favorite child? But yeah,
Yeah, I mean, I can tell you my favorites. That's easy enough. Uh, but as to, what stood out as a really fun experience, um, I might mention Preacher, just because there was a sense of uncharted territory. Like, what are we doing here exactly, and how far can we go, and what will happen if we do this? And God, it looks like it's worked. Shall we go further and further into this strange, dark country we've somehow managed to invent here? Yes, let's. And so there was a kind of a thrill to that. Beyond that, Hitman maybe as well, because it was the same. It gave you that same feeling, but in the DC universe. I might say that perhaps nowadays I don't quite get that same sense of the unknown, of uncharted territory, uh, or at least not in the sense I'm talking about, where you're pushing creative boundaries.
Mm.
What can be very satisfying nowadays is doing something like Battle Action, and finding that with the right approach, there is an audience for this older stuff. That if you can isolate what's great about those characters and bring it out into stories and get the best artists on it possible, you can breathe life into these old characters, and you can tell the audience about these characters and the writers and artists that created them. So I think, in terms of that sort of creative rush, or of just having fun, I think the emphasis has changed a bit. But there is less of that sense of the unknown, because I think the answer to the question now, how far can we go, is as far as we like.
Hmm. Yeah, that's I mean, and exactly what you were saying about Battle Action there. I mean, you did exactly that, what you set out to do, telling stories with those established characters, and with those wee vignettes that you had between the stories, sort of reintroducing or introducing people to the creators. So that was mission accomplished right there, for sure. I mean, with regard to pushing boundaries and sort of going as far as you can, we have a question from a regular customer of the store and a big fan, Alan McCourt. And
Mhm.
he asks, was there ever a moment that you looked at what you were about to send off and thought, there's no way they're printing this?
Yeah, I always get that sooner or later. And the answer is there have been times where I've thought it and I've just thought, what the hell, go ahead anyway. We'll soon find out. And um, I don't think I've ever had a moment where I've been a bit nervous about something and that anxiety has been vindicated. Usually when you run into stuff you can't do, you're surprised by it. You're thinking you're upset about this, but you're perfectly happy to let me do that. What? Um, that can be kind of odd. Of course, the thing is that once I started uh, doing the majority of my work for independent comics in the kind of early aughts, that in a way became a moot point because again and again, what I heard from publishers was, whatever you want to do, we'll take it. And I think after the little kerfuffle over the boys that saw it move from DC to Dynamite, there was very much a sense of, come on, with this guy, you know what you're getting.
Mm.
You can't complain if you get what you knew what you were going to be getting. So that's been less of an issue, really.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of which, I'm a huge fan of Chronicles of Wormwood.
Oh, right, right.
Really, really enjoyed what you did there. Probably no need for you ever to return to that word, but I'd be right there with you if you did.
Well, I might someday. I like the characters very much too,
Mm.
and Jason Burrows. He and I have talked about maybe going back at some point. It's hard to say because Avatar are a bit up in the air at the moment, and apart from anything else, I don't have an exact story. All I
Mm.
have is a feeling that I like the characters. I'd like to see Jimmy the Rabbit again, and I'd like
Classic.
to see Danny, and I'd like to see all the others. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of indie runs, I mean, the likes of Preacher and The Boys especially, I mean, those are long runs for indie stories. You know, so many indie titles these days, a long run is seen as 30 issues or less, but those were long runs. I mean, were they always planned out to be as long as they were, or was that a reaction to the success of the titles?
With Preacher, there was a sense, I think, of jumping into the dark and crossing your fingers. If you remember from around that time, a lot of people, not just myself, were coming off the DC titles that they'd taken into Vertigo, myself on Hellblazer, Grant on Doom Patrol and Animal Man, Jamie Delano, Peter Milligan, and then they were then doing these new creator-owned books, Preacher in my case, Invisibles in Grant's case, and so on. And it was a case of sort of spending the commercial capital you'd built up on the DC books and seeing if you could spin that into success on your own creator-owned book. But of course, there was no guarantee whatsoever. You look at the history of Vertigo, and it's far more miss than hit. I mean, as retailers, you must be aware of the number of books that came out and went under in less than a year. Sometimes it got sort of, it was almost tragicomic the way you could see some of those Vertigo books come out and think, for every Preacher or Y or Invisibles, there's about a dozen others that just go splat.
Mm.
So in the case of Preacher, it was very much like, let's hope this works. And when it did achieve the degree of success that it did, and it became not exactly obvious, but very, very likely that yes, this thing was going to make it. This thing was going to go the distance. At that point, I could start thinking about what it would look like as a 5-year run, what that story would be like told over the 66 issues. It was, for instance, around about the middle of the second year that I figured out how it ended. And then if you compare that with the boys, which I began roughly 10 years after I began Preacher, by that stage things are a lot more solid. My career's better established. Preacher and the Punisher have done their work for me in that regard. And if I decide I want to do a new ongoing book and it'll last 6-7 years, whatever, then there's a likelihood of that working out that will allow any publisher to fairly confidently take a punt on me. And that meant that for me, creatively, I could figure the whole thing out in advance. That doesn't mean I didn't leave myself a bit of leeway in creative terms. I gave myself plenty of space to sort of fill in gaps with things that occurred to me at the time. But there's no question that I knew roughly how the thing would go, and I definitely knew how it would end. And I had particular scenes in mind. Almost as soon as I thought up Butcher, actually, I imagined him. I imagined the scene where he pins the guy to the wall and guts him with the bread knife. I think it's a carving knife. Small details. Saying over and over again, "Why'd you kill me, dog, mate? Why'd you kill me, dog?" That was something that came to me almost as soon as Butcher himself did.
I mean, you recently returned to the boys, of course, with the Dear Becky mini series. I mean, what had you wanting to return to that world? And of course, people are probably wondering, are there any future plans to revisit again anytime soon, or have you closed the book on the boys?
Um, Second answer first. Probably nothing else to come. Doesn't mean I might not go back someday, but for the minute, I think you could call that one done. Perhaps not as done as, say, Preacher is. Preacher is absolutely, definitely, unquestionably finished. Partly because that story ended exactly in the way I thought it should, and partly because I could not, in good conscience, do that book again without Steve Dillon. It's just not possible. But the boys, who knows, maybe someday. But for now, happy to let it rest. As for Dear Becky, I wanted to write Becky, really. A character I thought that worked tremendously well in the original run, but for the long shadow that she casts over the story and over the character of Butcher, she's only actually in it for 2 issues. And I really liked writing her, and I liked writing her and Butcher together. And that's why I went back and took the opportunity to just write as much more material with Becky as I could. I just wanted to say more about what the two of them were like when they were together and the influence she had on him.
I mean, and we can't talk boys without talking the TV series, because I mean,
right.
For us, for both myself and Alan and many around, it's one of the very best things on TV at the minute. Can't think of another series like it. Has the success of it surprised you? And beyond that, have you been more surprised with just how much extreme content they've been able to portray on screen?
Again, second answer first. No, because I think that as the thing has progressed, everyone, audience and executives, have realized that that's part of the appeal. It's like, I'm going to tune in this week to see, I don't know, oh my God, what might I see this week? What's waiting for me? What's going to be pasted to the back of my eyeballs after an hour of this week? So I think that is part of the appeal. And as for the success of it, partly because I think Eric Kripke is such an expert at isolating what's successful about any given story and translating it into TV terms. And partly because I think the boys absolutely hit the sweet spot. No, the success of it hasn't surprised me too much. I should say that my answer to that question has been throughout my entire career. I'm not surprised it succeeded, but if it had fallen flat, that wouldn't have surprised me either, because sometimes you just can't plan for these things. But when I talk about the sweet spot, what I mean is, after 20 years of Marvel and DC movies laying the groundwork for the mainstream public, not the comic reading public, but the mainstream public, the cinema going and TV watching public, and educating them to the notion of shared superhero universes where you're walking down the street and Daredevil chases someone past you and the Hulk comes through a wall, and then 10 more yards and Spider-Man swings past. They all live in the same place. There's a world that has been populated by and changed by this superhuman population. That, I think, laid the groundwork for the boys in fine style.
Mm.
And people people will generally there's always a subsection of people generally who will enjoy seeing the piss taken out of something that they themselves love and enjoy. People who can watch the films and TV shows that I've talked about and enjoy them on the level they're intended, but then watch something like The Boys and see the thing they love being ripped to bits and enjoy that too. And they won't, there's no dichotomy there. They can enjoy both approaches for what they are. So yeah, The Boys unquestionably found its moment.
I think part of the success of the boys, and this is going to make me sound so old, but I'm going to say it anyway. But I think part of the success is because the casting has been so great, because the moments have been so great, because it's been so well filmed, and it's a series of moments. It then translates into that younger generation meme worthy, GIF worthy sort of
Mm.
generation. I mean, you can't scroll through Twitter without seeing a meme, which is Anthony Starr's Homelander laughing at surprise that when he killed somebody, everybody was happy about it. You
Mm-hmm.
have Carl Urban saying, well, if it isn't the invisible, this is a right now.
Right,
But I
right.
kind of feel that. I mean, like Sandman is an example. Now, I haven't watched Sandman yet. We watch one show at a time, so it's next on my list. But Sandman,
Mm-hmm.
I don't see entering that realm because maybe it's a slightly more serious show. Whereas with The Boys, which, as you said, takes the piss a little bit, it has a bit of fun. It just
Mm-hmm.
enters that meme worthy generation a little bit.
Maybe so. Maybe so. I mean, it is easier to take wisecracks and one-liners and turn them into gifs and the kind of things you're talking about than it would be. And I haven't seen the show either, but I did read the comic. Than it would be to maybe pull stuff out of Sandman and have a 10-line speech from Morpheus.
Mm.
Because as I recall, the Sandman did like to talk, and it would be hard to turn that into a sort of snappy answer to some political or historical injustice. Um, whether or not that's a good or bad thing, that's up to you to decide. But yes, the boys show does fit what you're talking about far better.
Yeah, I think it's just a way for it to easily jump into the social consciousness a lot easier because people may not watch it, but they see this in their Twitter timeline and they see it utilized in a fun way and they go, well, what's this from? And then they go and discover the show. So there's more organic ways to discover it through that method. But no, I'd mentioned the casting, as I say, is fantastic. Anthony Starr, Carl Urban are definitely standouts. But how happy were you to see Simon Pegg turn up as Huey's dad?
Oh, that was nice. That was really nice. I mean, Simon does have this uh, weird, long-standing relationship with the boys because he was, of course, drawn into the very first episode,
Yeah.
about which he was a real sport, by the way. So it's been lovely. It's been lovely him doing that. I should say also it was nice to get a line out of him for the Hawk the Slayer miniseries because again, there is that peculiar Simon Pegg Hawk the Slayer crossover from Spaced.
Mm-hmm.
That was a nice thing too. Yeah. Good bloke, Simon.
Yeah, I mean, sure. I think he writes the foreword in the boys' omnibus collection, so he writes the foreword for the first one. And I think
I
it was
think
all about taking that call of, "Can we draw your likeness into it?" And he's like, yeah, "I'm going to be in a comic book. This is amazing." I
yeah,
mean,
that worked out well.
do you have much involvement with the show at all, or is it just a case of here's the blueprint, here's the books, you guys do what you want with it, or is it easy to separate that? Is it?
Easier and easier, and honestly, as time goes by, the less involvement I have with it. I find that treating the two as separate is by far the more sensible option. To me, the show is its own success, and it ensures the continued success of the book.
Mm-hmm.
Its success means that the sales of the book are maintained, and in fact have risen. This can't come as a surprise for anyone. Have risen quite dramatically. So the show keeps the book current in its own particular way.
Yeah. No, I mean, I see it as a retailer. I mean, it's a book we can't keep on the shelves, because I always sell it to people rightly or wrongly of you think the show's extreme, read this, that
Well,
sort of thing, and people always come back
that's
the
not a
second time.
bad
So,
that's not a bad way of looking at it because there will always be things we can do in comics that
mhm.
they will balk at on TV and film. That's just a fact.
Um, and I mean, the other whenever we're talking about the how relevant the boys is. I mean,
Mm.
I think we probably reckon that you maybe had a past career as a soothsayer because I mean, if you look at how relevant it is now,
Mm.
even more so than whenever it was first released. Yeah, it's some really fantastic stuff.
Well, it came out of the era of the Bush administration, the George W. Bush administration, where serious wrongdoing without comeuppance was finding its way into the political mainstream. The two instances one would think of would be the invasion of Iraq and the response or lack of it to the Hurricane Katrina disaster.
Mm-hmm.
So you're talking about unpunished wrongdoing, and you're talking about ordinary people being abandoned by those who should look after them. And it was elements like that feeding into a narrative about superhuman power, and superhuman wrongdoing and superhuman irresponsibility, that really made the boys into what it was. And of course, in political terms, in the real world, it turns out that the second Bush administration was barely even a precursor to what came along in 2016 and what's been plaguing us ever since, in the UK and the US. Uh, a figure who who can do no wrong, no matter how much wrong he does. Um, it's what you're talking about. That surprised me as well, but it has given the boys a sort of a gruesome relevance that I guess helps the success of both book and TV show, but at the same time is enough to send a shiver down the spine.
Mm-hmm. Very much so.
No, very, very much so. I mean, working in some of the stuff from the attacks on the Capitol and stuff like that into the recent season, it just, as I say, it's scary how relevant it is. And, even when Homelander literally kills someone in front of a watching audience, he can still do no wrong. They're cheering him, and the Trump parallels are incredible. But anyway, TV questions over. Let's focus on the good stuff, the comic side of things. So I wanted to talk a little bit about your DC stuff. I mean,
Mhm.
Batman Reptilian, of course, came out recently with Liam Sharp. There was, of course, a fitting tribute to the late, very great Steve Dillon in the book, and also
Mhm.
the revelation that the project, as you say, was originally written with him in mind. I mean, how
Yep.
long did you have the seeds for Reptilian in your head?
Um, it came about in early 2016. Steve had been ill for a long time, but he was getting better and he was on his way back, career wise. And it occurred to me that if we were to do a book like Batman together, if we were to do the most cutthroat commercial project we possibly could, we'd essentially have the Preacher team on a Batman book as the Preacher TV show was coming out. And I couldn't imagine anything that would help Steve get back up to where he belonged more than something like that. So it was a fairly ruthless decision. So I wrote the scripts, and then sadly, of course, fate intervened in the worst possible way, and Steve passed. And the script sat around for a while, and then it was actually Marie Javins, who I mentioned earlier, who said, Liam Sharp is coming off a big project soon. He could do it. And Liam and I have been friends for 30 years and we've never worked together. So it seemed like, yes, here's this is the obvious thing to do. That was really its genesis. It's it's full of, I suppose, the ideas I had about Batman that I got from Dark Knight and uh, Year One, and to an extent, Killing Joke. That sort of darker Batman that was in vogue at the time. Um, that's why Batman is such a scary bastard in it, and a bit of a ruthless, inhuman, scary bastard at the same time. You have to understand that I probably haven't read a Batman comic cover to cover since um when did Mad Love come out? Was that the 90s?
Yeah, it would have been the 90s, not long after the animated show had introduced Harley. That was the origin of Harley.
Right. That's probably the last time I had read a Batman comic. I'd been vaguely aware of what was going on with the character because writing Hitman, which was, of course, set in a peculiar corner of Gotham City, I had to be aware of the big Bat crossovers and events that were going on at the time, and kind of write Hitman around that stuff. It was all terrible. It was all awful. But it was something I had to be aware of. But in terms of the actual character himself, that's about as much as I knew. So you're talking about someone with a sort of quarter century gap in his Batman knowledge, sitting down to write Batman. That and Reptilian was the result.
Yeah, I mean it's very much a book of two parts for me. We do a reviews podcast for the store, and like Batman Reptilian 1 was my pick of the week it came out, because it was so down and dirty and gritty. And I love the idea of this, guy on the steps of the courthouse bragging, and Batman just coming through the crowd and, humiliating them in front of everybody and all that kind of stuff. But the book becomes very different by the end. It's sort of almost like a big action based, almost kaiju book. I mean, was that massive change deliberate in your part to sort of throw the reader a little bit?
I think it was probably just a question of amping up the action to, the pulse pounding climax.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, True believer. But I think it was a question really of isolating what I could use from the Batman universe, which I found to be not much.
Mm-hmm.
So you'll find that the first couple of issues, you see the regular Batman rogues gallery being flattened. Because I find them so annoying. I just find them this sort of weird, chattering, multicolored, idiotic, incredibly annoying bunch of. Well, anyway, the Joker gets an episode to himself for his own mutilation, because I find him particularly annoying. And then the story settles on Killer Croc, because I think he's really the only character who I could take seriously enough as being physically imposing enough to cause a threat to Batman.
Mm-hmm.
That's probably why I glommed onto him in the first place. Of course, by the time Batman discovers him, he's in no shape to be a threat to anyone, and the real problem is developing from a different direction. But it's a result of me having this bright idea to help Steve out by doing a Batman book, and then looking at Batman and thinking, oh God, there's not much I can do here, and having to clear the decks of all the sort of chattering rabble so that I can focus on something new. It's interesting, actually, if you think about it, the original Dark Knight, very few of his villains are in it. Two-Face is in it at the start, and he's not even Two-Face. And then the Joker's in it, and he causes a certain amount of trouble. But apart from that, that's it.
To do with
The real problem, of course, is Superman in that book, and that again from another direction entirely. So you can see that Frank Miller's thinking, if I'm going to do a serious piece of noir pulp fiction, the quickest way for me to ruin it will be to have Tweedledum and Tweedledee running about the place, or Killer Moth, or I mean, clues in the name, Killer Moth, and so on and so forth. So if you're going to do, for someone like me who's not a Batman fan, the only way to do a Batman story really is to clear the decks of all the sort of irritating interference, so that you can get on with something of your own.
I think that's a very good point as well, because even if you look at Batman Year One, it's pre all of those villains. So I think what you're saying is quite accurate, that maybe even Frank Miller doesn't have that much of an interest. Similar to what you're saying, it's sort of like, clear the decks, just let's get one or two of these villains that I can work with, and then sort of go from there. It's an interesting point, actually.
Certainly the Frank Miller of that era, who was very good at isolating what was good about a character and a concept, and not letting the rest of the stuff get in the way. Mm-hmm. When Catwoman shows up in Batman Year One, she does not have some carefully thought out costume. She just puts on a sort of like a leotard cat costume thing that she could have got in a costume store. Mm-hmm. It looks like somebody's Halloween party outfit. It's Frank sort of showing you the closest way this could work in, for want of a better term, the real world, because he doesn't need the fantasy stuff ruining his pulp fiction.
Mm. And anything else on your slate for DC coming up? Anything you can tell us about?
For DC, nothing I can tell you about, but some possibilities. Um, maybe some characters I haven't written in a while, maybe not. Let's say talks are ongoing.
we'll we'll take that. And
Oh.
just switching to Marvel ways. I mean,
Mhm,
you have been and to some extent will always be synonymous with the Punisher.
mhm.
What attracted you to Frank Castle in the first place? And do you think there's a place for the character in the modern world, given the recent difficulties with that character?
Yeah. First of all, what attracted me to Frank was he reminded me of the characters I grew up on. He reminded me of those sort of hard-faced, stoic, uh, cold as ice gunfighters that I'd seen in 2000 AD. Most obviously, Johnny Alpha and Judge Dredd.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think that is because, of course, Frank, more or less, is inspired by the same cinematic characters that inspired Dredd and Johnny Alpha, and I suppose Dredger as
Mm-hmm.
well. I mean, Dredger even looks like Dirty Harry. Um, so that's why I like Frank. As to using the character, yes, I think it can be done. I think there is a place for uh, smartly written vigilante noir stories. Again, good pulp fiction. I think I still maintain that the quickest way to wreck most Punisher stories is to put superheroes in them. So I think the best way to write the Punisher is really to do it the way I've been doing for the past 20 years or so. Put him in his own world, forget about all the multicolored stuff, and tell crime stories and forget about superhero stories. As for the problems the character has been having, I would contend that largely comes down to the anxiety of people with a desperate desire to make a difference. We'll solve police violence by changing the Punisher's symbol. Um, that will not stop a single police officer from picking on a minority. It will not. It does not matter what they wear on their uniforms or paste to the side of their cars. They're either trained properly to do the job or they're not. They can either sublimate their own prejudices or they can't. This is window dressing. Changing the Punisher around or canceling the Punisher, and I mean that in a comic book sense where you terminate
Mm-hmm.
the
Mm-hmm.
of the book, not cancel culture. Canceling the Punisher will make no difference to these problems whatsoever. It will just make the person who makes that decision feel better about what they've done. And also the kind of people who get anxious about things and express that anxiety on social media. Half the problem, not to go off on a tangent here, but half the problem of the last 6 years has been people mistaking the moral high ground on social media for actual political power. This is a prime example, I'm sorry to say.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean that's it. I mean Marvel do seem to be quite cagey with the Punisher these days. You know, we chatted to, Declan Shelby recently about his disappointment. He had drawn 4 out of 5 issues for a mini series called Punisher Barracuda with Ed Brisson. It's just been
Mm-hmm.
shelved, hasn't seen the light of day. And even the main title, I don't know if you keep up to date with it or not, but the main title from Jason Aaron and Paul Azaceta and Jesus Says, it's been really, really good, but it's very, very
Mm-hmm.
different. It's seen a change with Frank taking up swords as opposed to guns. I mean,
Yeah.
that's less violent, isn't it? But I know that it was going to be 2 miniseries you were releasing them. Am I right? You had Punisher Soviet. Was there going to be another one lined up? And is
There
that
is
still a
another one.
possibility?
There is another one that'll see print next year. It's called Get Fury. It's
Mhm.
set in Vietnam, so technically he's not the Punisher, so the skull won't appear. So therefore, we should be all right. And certainly, I was speaking to people at Marvel recently, and they don't seem to have any problem with it. Uh, what would happen if I was to pitch them a new contemporary Punisher set in the present day, where he is unquestionably the Punisher with the skull on his
Mm-hmm.
chest and all the other trappings? I don't know. I don't know. I've seen the sort of alternate ninja version. I mean, it's done by Jason, and Torun Grunbeck's writing some of it as well. So it's well done, but it's just not for me because it's drifting into superhero territory. Ultimately, what would happen on the other hand if someone was to simply say you can do all the Punisher you want, but he doesn't have a skull in his chest? That wouldn't bother me for a second. The symbol is not the character. The symbol is just a great big eye-catching and gun sight drawing symbol to pull the shooter's eye onto his armored chest rather than his unarmored head. So it's like Batman's yellow and black thing, bat symbol thing. It's just a piece of psychological warfare designed to draw the eye. If you told me that we had to take that out of the equation, I wouldn't care for a second. What they'll do long term, I do not know. But as far as I know, there shouldn't be any trouble with my Vietnam story next year.
I mean, and that just what you say about the symbol on the chest. It always confused me, therefore, why Bullseye wore a target in his head. but there you are. I mean, we just should say, I mean, we really enjoyed Punisher Soviet, and therefore very glad that it snuck through before Marvel took their about turn on the character. And I'm sure things will turn around again. So
yeah, I mean, moving away from that, I mean, you've always kept your links and relationship with Rebellion, 2000 AD, and have work going with them at the moment. Of course, you mentioned Hawk the Slayer, recent Battle Action Special as two examples. What's so special about working with 2000 AD?
On one level, I did grow up on 2000 and I have a good deal of nostalgia for it. On the other hand, when I worked for them before, back in the early 90s, well, I wasn't up to the job and I didn't get much sense of editorial enthusiasm at that time. I talked about the kind of competence that I found in American comics. Sadly, at the time in British comics, the good guys, people like Steve McManus and Peter Hogan, had been sort of shoved into the background. And I found myself working with people whose enthusiasm did not match my own. I was certainly lacking in ability at that point, but not in enthusiasm. And when you're working with people who you get no sense of enthusiasm from at all, it does something to your own morale. I'm pleased to say that now, after many, many years working with Rebellion, I find people whose enthusiasm more than matches mine, and they're a pleasure to work with. They're also extremely competent. So the problems I used to have with British comics are gone. And it is very nice to work with people who want to put out good stuff. 2000 AD, work I would do for 2000 would be limited. You'll see a short story here, a slightly longer story there. I can't go into detail. There is one coming up with Kevin O'Neill that I think will give people a bit of a giggle. The majority of the work I would do for Rebellion will be forthcoming projects on Battle Action. I can't go into detail, but it won't surprise anyone who's read the special to learn that there will be more. We are going to do more in that particular department. The difference, I think, is that on 2000 AD, you have 45 years of history. With Battle Action, you had about 10, and then it was interrupted, and then there was nothing for 35 or 40 years. So with Battle Action, you're not talking, I said this something similar about Hawk the Slayer, actually. You're not talking about a massive franchise that has had multiple series, a movie, a TV spin-off. You're not talking about something that's on every t-shirt and every poster. You're talking about something with Battle Action that has pretty much lain fallow for 35 years, I think. I remember you said that you were reading Battle towards the end, but I think even by then it was mostly reprint, which is as good a way to read those stories as any. But you're talking about 35 years of dead space where nothing new's being done, and that's where I find my creative interest in something. Stories that I read in my childhood that just ended and went nowhere, and all their creative possibilities were left dangling, and hopefully I can now pick some of those up and explore them. Yeah, 2000, of course, with 45 years, I'm not saying that there's nothing new to be done with Dread or any of the or some of the other characters, but if there is, I'm not the one to explore it.
Yeah, I mean that battle action special was great surprise to see it come out. It was great to see the likes of ace fighter pilot sort of Johnny Red,
Mm.
sort of back there, Dredger, some of those characters. And as you say, I didn't get into it until a little later, but
Mm.
Battle was definitely one of my formative comic reading experiences.
Yeah.
Even as you say, it was mostly reprints and was moving towards that slightly more Stormforcey and that merge with Eagle. But you mentioned Hawk the Slayer, which
Mm.
is your recent miniseries from Rebellion with legendary Judge Dredd artist Harry Flint. It
Mm-hmm.
is a sequel to a cult classic movie of the same name. Absolutely great book. Totally captured, the feel and the theme of the movie. But it's definitely an out there choice for a book. What's the story behind that? Is it a favorite of yours or?
It is. It is. Sometimes you have ideas that just won't go away no matter what. And it's something that for some reason got a lock on my imagination when I was 10 or 11 years old and wouldn't go away. And I don't mean in that so bad it's good way that people are fond of talking about, that sort of uber irony that I almost find a bit tiresome. To me, bad is just bad. Hawk has enough good stuff about it that it sort of overcomes the cheese. That won't be true for everyone, but it is for me. And it it was really just an idea that persisted for years and years. Sometimes it was almost a kind of a challenge. People would say to me, publishers would say to me, "Is there a franchise you'd like to revive? Would you like to bring something back?" And I would say, "Yeah, see if you can get the rights to Hawk the Slayer." Thinking, ha ha, impossible. But of course, these things have a way of taking on a life of their own. Word spreads. It's mentioned to publishers that I want to do this thing. And in the meantime, in my head, the question, supposing you did, just supposing you did, what would you do exactly? That's churning away too. And what you get scenes, you get new characters, you get locations. Pretty soon you've got a story, and that's the result. And I must say, Henry did an absolutely fantastic job on it. I mean, the word I've used in connection with his art on that book is lush. I just find it
Yes.
incredibly lush. It's like a sumptuous feast. It was a pleasure to see him do that. Actually, absolute beautiful job. I think he surprised himself a bit.
Yeah, I mean that's what I'm saying. I mean it's the combination of the writing and the dialogue. The dialogue really matches the dialogue from the original movie. You can almost I can almost read it in the voices, and the patterns. But as you say, that art really conjured up sort of those themes and those tones and those feels. So great
Yeah,
work.
it looks like the old one, as it
Yeah,
should.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to start winding down here. You've been extremely generous with your time. We've just got a couple more short questions just to finish off with. I wanted to mention Lion and Eagle, of course. Trade collection coming up for that soon. There's always you always seem to enjoy writing war stories. What is it about war stories that appeals so much to you?
Partly it's like everyone else in the business, I look to the stuff I grew up on. And I grew up, apart from 2008, largely on war stories. Beyond that, reading war stories and watching war movies and coming to the understanding as a kid that even allowing for the obvious hyperbole that surrounds any kind of fiction, but in this instance, military fiction, um, this, these are stories that were based on things that were done by real people. Um, that I think got a hold of me in a way that a lot of fantasy material never really did, or not to the same extent. Um, and so it led me to an interest in military history where I found out more and more about the things that happened in real life. And if ever there was a case of truth being stranger than fiction, you'll find it in military history and memoirs. You'll see the stuff that just boggles the mind. And so it was that when I got to the point where I could start doing a lot of my own stuff, war comics were the obvious genre for me to go to. And you'll see that continue as well. Both my own stuff like The Lion and the Eagle and the String Bags and so on, and more battle action, just because I think that those battle action characters are worth persisting with. There's
Yeah, I
life
mean,
yet.
yeah, it's clear you've developed like a real knowledge base with regard to military history. You know, I've listened to other interviews with you and read other interviews with you, and you could. It seems like you could easily have turned your hand to writing, you know, military fiction books or novels or even, you know, history. So we're really glad that you've decided to express that through the visual medium.
Yeah, I could have, but I sometimes think about this, in about 20 plus years of writing war comics, I've been able to cover, I mean, I've written several dozen issues of things, and I've been able to go from the Battle of Kursk to Toronto to the jungles of Burma to the hunt for the Bismarck to the Yom Kippur War in Israel to the jungles of Vietnam. If I was a filmmaker, I'd never be able to get anywhere near that record. Apart from the fact that war movies tend not to perform as well as a lot of other genres, straight war movies I'm talking about here, I'd never have been able to get the budgets together for a fraction of those topics and cover a fraction of that territory. I'd never have gotten near it. Same with novels. Novels are easy too, but again, you got to think about the market. With comics, there is still that wonderful feeling: go anywhere, do anything, say whatever you want. And applied to war movies, to war comics, it gets me. It gets me the stuff I've been able to do all these years, and the stuff I'm going to continue to do. So it's the immediacy and the ease with which you can do comics that I think has stood me in good stead here.
And you know, speaking of saying what you want, we recently chatted to the fantastic Torun Gronbeck, who shares your love of war stories.
Yes.
And we hope to have her in the store at some point in the future. But surely there's a collaboration coming there sometime in the future.
Not exactly a collaboration, but Torun will be working on a war story soon, something that I am peripherally involved with.
Interesting.
You're so good at keeping these secrets. We keep trying to trip you up, and it's just not happening. But yeah, final few questions, and we have to talk quickly about Earth. Where in the world did the idea for a children's book come from? You know, we enjoyed it so much. You know, my other half Vicky was down seeing it in a skill, and you very
Yeah, of course, yeah.
signed it to Alfie, who is now here in the world and healthy and happy and everything else.
Good. Glad to
We
hear it.
we even released a podcast episode where I did a read along of the book, and
Oh,
I did
nice one.
I did voices and everything, and we've got a lot of younger readers in store. I pass on to them for them to listen along with the book. But I
Uh-huh.
it'll never cease to amaze me that they literally said, from the creator of Punisher, from the writer of
Right.
Punisher and creator of Preacher comes a children's book. Where did the idea for a children's book come from?
Um, a variety of things. I'd become friends with Rob Steen, who was the illustrator of Ricky Gervais' Flanimals children's books, which I liked very much. My wife and I, we don't have kids of our own, but we have many friends who have kids, of course, and you find yourself buying them books, children's books. And I found myself looking at some of these books and just being really impressed by the stories and the art. I mean, there's a lot I could mention, but the most obvious one is John Classen, and I Want My Hat Back. So a degree of inventiveness that really sort of sparked me off. And then more specifically, or Earth, you'll not be surprised to hear, is essentially based on one of those diagrams of evolution where the little tadpole thing becomes a lizard or a frog that slithers up onto the land, that becomes a biped, that is soon a monkey, that becomes a caveman, that is, a Homo sapiens. And I think that was probably where I got the idea. As to why I did it, when you have an idea, I always think it does have to be used, especially when it's kind of crying out to be used. Also, about 10 or 15 years ago, I found myself getting disturbed by the rise of this sort of celebration of ignorance. combined with, which is still prevalent, combined with um, this is something that comes from the Bush era as well. I'm sorry to say, people turning back towards what I might call the ignorance of organized religion, and and away from the enlightenment of science, and seeing that and being depressed by it and thinking I should say something about this. Earth is the result. Earth seemed to be the best way to say something, I suppose, to indoctrinate children. And who doesn't like to?
you, you're talking to someone who was heavily involved in removing the creationism from the Giant's Causeway exhibit many years ago. So, I'm right with you. I'm right with you. So we're getting very close to the end of our chat, and it has been absolutely wonderful chatting to you and about all of these different things. Before we wind up, is there anything else in the pipeline you'd like to tell us about? Anything that we can tell our listeners about? Anything you'd like to push?
Well, let's think. There are bits and pieces coming up for 2000 AD. There will be an announcement about more battle action soon, in a month or so. There's Jimmy's Little Bastards, which has just started coming out from Aftershock. You mentioned there's going to be a collection of The Lion and the Eagle. Beyond that, next year we'll see Punisher Get Fury, the Vietnam story. And Jason Burrows is currently drawing a brand new horror story for me that I can't go into in too much detail, but it does have a sort of vaguely Irish bent. You'll see that when it comes out, but that should be out sometime next year.
Wonderful.
Perfect. Well, we gave you the forewarning at the start. We always like to finish our interviews in the exact same way. So we're just curious, if you have a favorite DC series of all time, a favorite Marvel series of all time, and a favorite indie series of all time.
All right. Well, let's see. DC. I would probably say Screamer. It would be something like Watchmen or Swamp Thing, but I like Miracle Man better than both of them. And V for Vendetta technically isn't DC. It started with Warrior. So I'm going to go for Screamer by Peter Milligan and the sadly no longer with us Brett Ewins and Steve Dillon. Screamer, I'm not sure if it's in print, but it's a sort of future dystopia story about a city ruled by gangs, with Vito Screamer, who's one of those giant Brett Ewins characters in the mold of Kano, for instance, in charge of the biggest gang. And the story, his story is contrasted with that of an ordinary family trying to survive in this hellish future society that Vito has helped create. So wonderfully stark artwork by Steve and Brett, and a really smart story by Pete Milligan. Must be almost 30 years old now. Had kind of a convoluted history as regards its actual creation, but it helped launch Steve in particular in the US. And of course, I did very well out of that. But a really good one if you can get hold of it. Marvel, I'm gonna probably go for Elektra Assassin, which ultimately I think is my favorite of Frank's 80s work. The best period in his work, when Elektra is, of course, the story of the female assassin he introduced in Daredevil. You've got Bill Sienkiewicz on the art. The thing is crazy. It's one big hallucinogenic, super violent rush. It's like both of them are off their heads on drugs, and yet there's a coherent story in there behind all the madness. Some rough stuff in there, some very funny stuff in there. The kind of characters that would probably not pass muster today, but the sort of stuff I love reading. Sex, drugs, politics, samurai swords, you name it. And indie comics, I would say that Concrete by Paul Chadwick is probably the best comic of the last 40 years. I think it's that good. It's so well written and well drawn, and for the fact that it's about a bloke whose brain is stolen by aliens and stuck in a big concrete body, one of the most human stories I've ever read in comics. There's a sort of an incredible creative coherence and care brought to that book. It really is, I think, one of the most very low key, but one of the most tremendous stories you'll ever read in comics. So there's your three.
Excellent. Three very diverse answers there, and I'm definitely gonna have to look up Screamer, especially. That sounds really, really interesting. So yeah, so that is everything from us. I mean, as I say, you've been exceptionally generous with your time. It's been an absolute pleasure chatting to you. You know, you really have written some of the most important books, certainly in my comic reading lifetime. As I say, books that I always go back to, books that are, you know, endlessly rereadable as well. So, you know, I thank you for that. And of course,
Pleasure.
you guys, you can meet the man himself in Forbidden Planet. You're of course coming over to Belfast for a signing soon, Saturday, 3rd of September, I believe. From
That's right.
1 p.m. to 3 p.m. So you may get there early because there's going to be a big queue. I may be at the head of it. I may just have to get Vicky to watch the store that day. We shall see.
We'll be there.
All right. All right. Well, thanks, guys. Really enjoyed that. Cheers.
It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks very much.
Hope you listeners, hope you guys enjoyed that. And we'll look forward to being back with you soon. So thanks again.